The courtroom felt heavier than most people expected. Not because of the size, it was actually pretty standard, but because of what everyone thought might happen inside. Cameras lined the back, reporters whispered in the aisles, and even the bailiff seemed to move slower, like he didn't want to disturb the tension hanging in the air. Outside, the street was packed. People held phones, signs, and coffee cups waiting for any scrap of news. This wasn't just another legal hearing. This was the day Elon Musk was supposed to testify, and rumors had been swirling for weeks that he might say something shocking about someone very powerful. He walked in alone. No entourage, no flashy suit. Just a black jacket, jeans, and that familiar tired look in his eyes. He didn't glance at the crowd or wave. He kept his head down, walked straight to the witness stand, and sat without a word. The judge, a woman with silver hair and calm eyes, gave a small nod. The lawyer shuffled papers. Everyone held their breath. The case itself wasn't about politics. It was a lawsuit involving a tech company that claimed one of Musk's firms stole trade secrets. Pretty dry stuff, honestly, but the internet had turned it into something else. For days, conspiracy theories exploded online. People claimed Musk had dirt on high-level officials, that he'd been pressured to stay quiet, and that this courtroom was where the truth would finally come out. Most of it was nonsense, but when someone as famous as Musk shows up in person, people listen, even if he's just talking about software code. The first lawyer to question him was from the plaintiff's side. He was polite, professional, and stuck to the facts. He asked about emails, project timelines, employee contracts. Musk answered in short sentences, sometimes with a sigh, sometimes with a dry joke that made a few people chuckle nervously. Nothing explosive. Nothing about anyone famous outside the tech world. The crowd started to fidget. Maybe the rumors were wrong. Then came the defense attorney. She was younger, sharp-eyed, and clearly prepared. She didn't waste time. After a few routine questions, she leaned forward slightly and asked, "Mr. Musk, in your communications with various government agencies over the past decade, have you ever been asked to withhold information for reasons unrelated to national security?" The room went quiet. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. Musk looked at her for a long moment. He didn't look nervous, just thoughtful, like he was deciding how much to say. Finally, he said, "I've been asked to stay quiet more times than I can count. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not so good." A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled faster. The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Musk, please be specific, but only if it's relevant to this case." He nodded. "It's not directly relevant, Your Honor, but since the question was asked, I'll say this. A few years ago, during the early days of a certain federal investigation, I was contacted by someone connected to a major political campaign. Not to interfere, just to clarify my position on a public statement I'd made." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They didn't threaten me, not outright, but the message was clear. If I kept talking, things could get complicated for my companies. Permits, contracts, regulatory approvals, all of it could slow down. Or stop. He didn't name names, not yet. But everyone in that room knew who he was hinting at. The political world had only a few players big enough to make that kind of call. And one of them had been under intense scrutiny for years. The lawyer didn't push for a name. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked, "Did you comply?" Musk let out a small laugh, bitter, not amused. "At first I did. I thought, fine, I've got rockets to build, cars to make. I don't need this fight. But then I realized something. Silence isn't neutral. When you stay quiet about pressure like that, you're helping the system that uses it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the railing. "So no, I didn't stay quiet. I kept talking. And yeah, things got messy. Projects got delayed. Meetings got canceled. But I'd rather lose a contract than lose my voice." The courtroom was completely still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Later, during a short break, people spilled out onto the courthouse steps, buzzing. One young reporter called her editor, whispering, "He didn't say her name, but it's obvious who he meant." A man in a worn-out jacket shook his head and said to no one in particular, "I knew it." They always protect their own. A woman with a baby stroller just stood there, listening, her face unreadable. Back inside, the judge warned everyone that speculation wasn't evidence. She reminded Musk that he was under oath and should stick to facts, not implications. He nodded respectfully. But the damage, or the truth, was already out there. What made this moment so powerful wasn't the accusation itself. It was the way Musk spoke. Not like a billionaire shouting from a podium, but like a regular person who'd been pushed too far. His voice cracked once when he talked about choosing between his work and his principles. He rubbed his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem proud of what he'd done, just tired of pretending it didn't happen. And that's what stuck with people. Not the politics, not the conspiracy theories, but the human part, the cost of speaking up, the weight of staying silent, and the quiet courage it takes to say, "This isn't right," even when the whole system is telling you to shut up. As the afternoon wore on, the questions returned to technical details, server logs, encryption keys, employee NDAs. The magic of that earlier moment faded into legal jargon, but no one forgot it. Cameras kept rolling, phones kept recording, and within an hour, clips of Musk's testimony were everywhere, on news sites, social feeds, group chats. Headlines screamed, "Musk drops bombshell," or "Tech Titan accuses political insider." But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the faces of the people watching, in the way a teenager paused his game to listen, in the way an old man nodded slowly as if he'd seen this all before, in the way a woman working a night shift replayed the audio on her break, wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone finally told the truth. By the time court adjourned for the day, Musk was already gone. No interviews, no statements, just a black car pulling away from the curb, windows tinted, disappearing into city traffic. But the ripple he created kept spreading. That night, in living rooms and bus stops and late-night diners, people talked. Not just about Musk or the case, but about their own experiences. Times they'd been told to stay quiet. Times they'd backed down because it was easier. The courtroom moment became a mirror. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like someone with real power had looked into that mirror and refused to look away. No one knew what would happen next. Would there be follow-up questions? Would someone finally be named? Would anything actually change? Probably not overnight, but something had shifted. A line had been crossed, not in law, but in public trust. And once that happens, it's hard to go back. Outside the courthouse, a street vendor sold hot dogs under a flickering lamp. A college student filmed a TikTok with shaky hands. A security guard locked the doors, humming softly to himself. Life went on. But the air felt different. Lighter, maybe, or just charged with possibility. Because sometimes all it takes is one person, in one room, saying one honest thing to remind everyone else that truth still matters, even if it's messy, even if it's risky, even if it comes from someone you don't fully trust. And that was just day one. The morning after the testimony, the city woke up buzzing. Not the usual kind of buzz, like a new coffee shop opening or a street festival, but the kind that hums under your skin. The kind that makes strangers glance at each other on the subway like they're all part of the same secret. News vans lined the courthouse block again, but this time, they weren't just waiting for a statement. They were waiting for fallout. Inside the courtroom, things felt different too. The air was tighter, like everyone knew the calm was temporary. Lawyers arrived earlier, clutching thicker folders. Reporters scribbled notes before anyone even spoke. Even the judge seemed to move with more purpose, her eyes sharper behind her glasses. And when Elon Musk walked in, same black jacket, same quiet stride, he didn't look at the crowd. He just sat, folded his hands, and waited. The plaintiff's lawyer started the day by trying to steer things back to the original case. He asked about server access logs, internal memos, employee turnover, dry stuff. Important maybe, but dull. He was clearly hoping to bury the drama under paperwork. But the defense attorney had other plans. She stood slowly, adjusted her blazer, and asked a simple question. "Mr. Musk, you mentioned yesterday that you were contacted by someone connected to a political campaign. Can you describe that conversation?" The judge frowned. "Counsel, we've been over this. Unless it directly relates to the alleged theft of intellectual property, it's outside the scope." The lawyer didn't back down. "Your Honor, if Mr. Musk was pressured to alter his public statements during a federal investigation, and if that pressure came from someone with influence over regulatory bodies that oversee his companies, then it's relevant to whether his actions or inactions were made under duress, which could impact how we interpret his business decisions during that period." It was a stretch, but not a crazy one. The judge sighed, then nodded. "Fine, one question. Keep it narrow." The lawyer turned back to Musk. "Who contacted you?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then out the window where a pile. It was someone close, a senior advisor. They called me late one night. Said they admired my work but were concerned about my recent tweets. He paused. They said, "You're a smart man. You know how things work. A few quiet months now could mean smooth sailing later." Then they mentioned a satellite launch license that was stuck in review. Said it might move faster if I stopped commenting on certain investigations. Again, no name. But again, everyone knew. There was really only one campaign that fit the timeline, the tone, the level of access, and only one person whose inner circle had that kind of reach. The courtroom stayed silent for a full 10 seconds. Someone coughed. A pen dropped. The judge finally said, "Mr. Musk, are you prepared to provide documentation of this call? Emails? Call logs?" "I have the call log," he said. "The call itself wasn't recorded. I didn't think to at the time. But I wrote an email to my general counsel the next morning summarizing it. I can produce that." The defense lawyer asked to enter it as evidence. The plaintiff's team objected, calling it hearsay and irrelevant. The judge took a long look at both sides, then said, "We'll review it in chambers. For now, move on." But the damage again was done. Not legally, maybe, but in the court of public attention. Within minutes, social media lit up. Clips spread faster than before. This time, people weren't just speculating. They were connecting dots. Old news articles resurfaced. Stories about delayed permits for electric vehicle factories, sudden shifts in FAA approvals for rocket launches, meetings that were mysteriously canceled. None of it proved anything on its own. But together, it painted a picture. Outside, a group of protesters had gathered not for or against Musk but for transparency. One held a sign that read, "Truth isn't a trade secret." Another just stood quietly, holding a photo of a voting booth. A few feet away, a man in a suit argued with a journalist. "He's just deflecting. This case is about stolen code, not politics." The journalist shrugged. "Maybe. But if he's telling the truth, it's bigger than code." Back inside, the rest of the day's testimony dragged. Technical details. Corporate structures. Software architecture. Most of the audience tuned out, but their phones stayed on, recording just in case something else slipped out. Musk answered every question, but his mind seemed elsewhere. At one point, he stared at the ceiling for a full minute before answering a simple yes or no question. The judge didn't scold him. She just waited. During the lunch break, something unexpected happened. A woman in her 60s, wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a canvas tote bag, walked up to the courthouse steps. She didn't have a press badge or a lawyer's briefcase. She just stood there looking up at the building. A reporter approached her. "Are you here for the Musk hearing?" She nodded. "I used to work for the State Department," she said quietly. "Not high up, just an admin assistant. But I saw things. Emails forwarded to the wrong people. Meetings moved last minute. Pressure applied in ways no one would ever write down." She paused, then added, "If he's saying what I think he's saying, I believe him. Because I saw it too." She didn't give her name, didn't stay for an interview, just turned and walked away, disappearing into the lunchtime crowd. But her words got passed around. By evening, they were part of the story. That night online, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about Musk anymore. People started sharing their own stories. Teachers told about curriculum changes pushed by political donors. Small business owners described sudden inspections after speaking at city council meetings. Nurses recalled being told to avoid certain topics in patient care discussions. The courtroom moment had opened a door, and now everyone was walking through it carrying their own truths. Meanwhile, in a quiet office across town, a team of fact-checkers worked late. They weren't trying to prove Musk right or wrong. They were just tracing timelines. When the call allegedly happened, when the launch license was delayed, when the advisor in question was active in the campaign. By midnight, they'd confirmed that the dates aligned. Not proof of wrongdoing, but not a coincidence either. The next morning, before court resumed, a major news outlet published a short article. Musk's claims align with known regulatory delays. Records show. It wasn't a headline grabber, but it was enough to keep the story alive. When the hearing reconvened, the mood had changed again. Now even the plaintiff's lawyer seemed less eager to shut things down. Maybe he realized the story was too big to contain. Or maybe he, too, was wondering if there was more to this than stolen software. The defense attorney didn't ask about politics again. Instead, she focused on Musk's state of mind during the period in question. "Were you under unusual stress at the time?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Every tweet, every interview, I had to think, who's going to get mad about this? That's not how innovation works. You can't build the future if you're scared to speak in the present." It was the most human thing he'd said yet. Not about rockets or AI or billion-dollar deals, but about fear. About the weight of being watched, judged, and possibly punished for speaking your mind. Later, during another break, a young intern from the public defender's office sat on a bench outside, eating a sandwich. An older lawyer sat beside her. "You believe him?" she asked. The lawyer took a sip of coffee. "I don't know if he's telling the whole truth, but I believe he's telling a truth. And sometimes, that's enough to matter." Back in the courtroom as the afternoon wore on, something subtle happened. The judge, who had been strict about relevance, allowed one more question about the political contact. Just one. "Mr. Musk," the defense attorney asked, "did you ever report that call to anyone? An ethics board? A journalist?" "No," he said. "At the time, I thought it would just make things worse. And honestly, I didn't think anyone would care. Billionaires complaining about pressure. People would just say, like, cry me a river. So I stayed quiet. Until now." That admission hit harder than any accusation, because it wasn't about power, it was about isolation. About realizing that even with all the money and fame in the world, you can still feel alone when you're being asked to look the other way. By the end of the day, the legal case hadn't moved much. But something else had. People weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were watching a moment where someone with everything to lose chose to speak anyway. And in a world full of polished statements and scripted interviews, that raw honesty, even if incomplete, even if self-serving, felt rare. As the sun set, the crowd outside was smaller but more focused. No shouting, no signs, just people standing quietly waiting to see what came next. Because now everyone understood this wasn't really about a lawsuit. It was about who gets to decide what's said and who gets to stay silent. And part 2 had only just begun. The third day started with rain. Not a storm, just a steady gray drizzle that made the courthouse steps slick and the air smell like wet concrete and old newspapers. Inside, the usual buzz was quieter, more focused. People weren't just waiting for a spectacle anymore. They were waiting for consequences. Elon Musk arrived later than usual, his jacket damp at the shoulders, his hair slightly messy. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much, which, given the past 48 hours, was probably true. Reporters tried to shout questions as he walked in, but he kept his eyes forward and didn't answer. He didn't need to. The whole world was already talking. What no one expected was who showed up in the public gallery that morning. Not a celebrity, not a politician, but a retired federal investigator, someone who'd worked on cybersecurity cases for over 20 years. He sat in the back row, hands folded, watching everything with calm, tired eyes. When a reporter recognized him and leaned over to ask why he was there, he just said, "Because sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, and today it might finally step into the light." Back at the witness stand, the defense attorney picked up where she'd left off, but not with politics. Instead, she shifted to something more personal. "Mr. Musk," she asked, "you've spoken about pressure, but let's talk about cost. What did staying quiet actually cost you?" He exhaled slowly. "More than money. My team was working on a satellite project that could have brought internet to remote villages, places with no schools, no hospitals, nothing. We had the tech ready, but the launch kept getting delayed. No clear reason. Just more review needed. Months went by. People in those villages kept waiting." His voice dropped. "One of my engineers sent me a photo. A kid in Kenya, holding a broken phone, staring at the sky like he was waiting for a signal that never came. That's what silence cost. Not me, them." A few people in the courtroom looked down. Someone sniffled quietly. This wasn't the cold, calculating tech billionaire people expected. This was someone carrying guilt. The lawyer let the moment settle, then asked, "And when you decided to speak up, despite the risk, what changed?" "I realized," he said, "that if people like me stay quiet, then only the people who want secrets get to control the story. And that's not how a free society works." Just then, the judge interrupted, not to scold, but to ask a question of her own. "Mr. Musk, you've implied that your companies faced retaliation. Can you point to one specific instance where you believe a government decision was influenced by your public statements, not by regulation or safety? He didn't hesitate. The Nevada Gigafactory expansion. We applied for environmental approval in early 2016. Standard process. But right after I tweeted support for an independent investigation into campaign emails, the review suddenly required additional interagency consultation. It took 11 extra months. 11 months we didn't have. He looked at the judge directly. I'm not saying someone wrote an email saying punish Musk, but I know how systems work. You don't need orders. You just need a whisper in the right ear. The courtroom stayed still. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Later that morning, during a recess, something unusual happened. A man in a worn suit approached the defense table. He wasn't a lawyer, just a former mid-level staffer from a federal agency now working as a consultant. He handed the defense attorney a sealed envelope and whispered something before walking away. She opened it, read the contents, and her eyes widened slightly. She didn't say anything, but she tucked the paper into her folder like it was gold. When court resumed, she didn't mention the envelope. But she did ask a new question. Mr. Musk, did anyone ever confirm to you off the record that your public comments were affecting your business dealings with the government? He paused. Not directly, but once at a private dinner with a few regulators, one of them leaned over and said, "You'd be amazed how many people read your tweets before signing your permits." He smiled like it was a joke, but his eyes weren't laughing. That line, "You'd be amazed how many people read your tweets," spread like wildfire by lunchtime. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was the kind of thing people recognize from their own lives. The offhand comment that says everything without saying anything at all. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the mood was heavier. A group of high school students stood near the steps recording a podcast for their civics class. "It's not about who's right or wrong," one of them said into the mic. "It's about whether regular people can ever really know what's going on behind closed doors." Nearby, an elderly woman sat on a bench feeding crumbs to pigeons. She'd been coming every day, not because she cared about tech lawsuits, but because her husband had worked in government decades ago. He used to say, she told a stranger, that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits and watches, and makes you wonder if it's worth speaking up. Back inside, the plaintiff's lawyer finally changed tactics. Instead of fighting the political angle, he leaned into it, but carefully. "Mr. Musk," he asked, "if you truly believed you were being pressured, why didn't you go public sooner? Why wait until you were under oath in a lawsuit that has nothing to do with politics?" It was a good question. And Musk answered it like he'd been waiting for it. "Because I didn't want this to become a weapon. The moment I name names, it turns into a circus. People stop listening to the issue and start picking teams. I didn't want to add fuel to that fire." He looked around the room. But here's the thing, silence also fuels the fire. Every time someone stays quiet because they're scared, it tells the next person, "Don't bother speaking up. No one will believe you. So maybe this courtroom is the only place left where the truth can be said without it turning into a meme or a slogan." The judge didn't interrupt. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. Then, in the afternoon, the defense attorney made her move. She stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence, recently provided by a third party, that may shed light on the timing of certain regulatory delays mentioned by the witness." The plaintiff's team objected immediately. "This is a fishing expedition. We don't even know what's in that document." But the judge, after a long pause, said, "Submit it under seal. I'll review it before deciding if it's admissible." As the document was handed up, a ripple went through the room. No one knew what it said. But the fact that it existed changed everything. Even Musk looked surprised. By the end of the day, the legal case still hadn't moved forward much. But something else had. People weren't just talking about Musk anymore. They were talking about systems, how decisions get made, who gets heard, and who gets ignored. A teacher in Ohio posted a video about how her school board suddenly canceled a lesson on media literacy after a parent complained to a local official. A small-town mayor in Colorado wrote an op-ed about state grants mysteriously disappearing after he criticized a state policy. The courtroom had become a mirror, and everyone was seeing their own reflection. That evening, on a quiet street far from the courthouse, a man sat in his garage, working on an old radio. He'd been following the trial online. He wasn't rich, didn't know anyone famous. But he remembered a time years ago when he'd spoken up at a city meeting about polluted water in his neighborhood. Nothing happened except his property tax assessment went up the next month. He never proved a connection, but he always wondered. Now hearing Musk talk about permits and whispers and waiting, it felt familiar, not because they lived the same life, but because the feeling was the same, that uneasy sense that speaking your mind might cost you more than you're ready to pay. Back at the courthouse, as the lights dimmed for the night, the bailiff locked the doors, but the story wasn't locked away. It was out there, in kitchens, in classrooms, in late-night texts between friends asking, "Did you hear what he said today?" And the most surprising thing? People weren't just taking sides. They were asking questions, real ones, like, what would I have done? Or who's pressuring people in my town? Or is silence really safer or just easier? No one had all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like people were finally willing to ask. Because part 3 wasn't about revealing a secret. It was about realizing that the real secret wasn't who did what. It was how many of us have stayed quiet just in case. And that kind of truth? It doesn't need a courtroom to be real. It just needs someone brave enough or tired enough to say it out loud. The 4th day dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that feels like the world has taken a deep breath and is holding it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was smaller but more determined. Fewer gawkers, more people who'd been there since day one, notebooks in hand, eyes sharp. They weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were tracking a story that had started in a boardroom and somehow ended up touching something deeper. The quiet agreements we all make about what we say, what we ignore, and who gets to decide. Inside, the tension was different too. Not louder, but tighter, like a guitar string tuned just past comfort. The judge arrived early, her robe crisp, her expression unreadable. The lawyers avoided eye contact. And when Elon Musk walked in, he didn't look at the gallery. He looked straight ahead like he was bracing for something. What no one expected was that the day wouldn't start with Musk at all. Instead, the defense called a new witness, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and a calm voice. She introduced herself as a former compliance officer for a federal regulatory agency. She'd retired 2 years ago, she said, and had no ties to Musk, his companies, or the opposing side. She was there, she explained, because she'd seen something she couldn't unsee. I reviewed hundreds of permit applications over my career, she said, hands folded on the stand. Most were routine, but every once in a while, a file would come across my desk with a little yellow sticky note on it. No name, no signature. Just a phrase like handle with care or await guidance. She paused. Those files always belonged to people or companies that had recently made public statements critical of certain political figures or investigations. A murmur moved through the room. The judge didn't stop it. Did you ever ask what the notes meant? The defense attorney asked. I did, she said. Once my supervisor told me, some things don't need explaining. Just follow the rhythm. I didn't ask again. She went on to describe how delays weren't always official. No denials, no rejections. Just silence. Requests would sit in review. Meetings would be rescheduled. Emails would go unanswered. It wasn't illegal, she admitted. But it wasn't fair either. And after a while, people learned to keep their heads down. When she stepped down, the room felt heavier. This wasn't speculation. This was a first-hand account from someone with nothing to gain. Then Musk returned to the stand. The defense attorney didn't waste time. Mr. Musk, after your testimony began, have you noticed any changes in how your companies are treated by government agencies? He almost smiled, a tired, knowing look. Funny you should ask. Yesterday afternoon, I got a call from the FAA. They fast-tracked a launch license we've been waiting on for months. Said they assessed priorities. No explanation. Just done. He leaned forward. That's how it works. You speak up and suddenly things move. Not because they changed their minds, but because they don't want the story to grow. It was a quiet bombshell. Not an accusation, just an observation. But everyone understood. The system responds not to justice, but to attention. The plaintiff's lawyer, sensing the tide shifting, tried a new angle. Mr. Musk, isn't it true that you've used your platform to attack many public figures, not just one? Isn't this just another example of you turning a business dispute into a political performance? Musk didn't flinch. I've criticized plenty of people, left, right, center, but this isn't about criticism. It's about pressure. There's a difference between saying someone's wrong and being told your business will suffer if you keep saying it. He looked around the room. If I were just performing, I'd have named names on Twitter weeks ago. I'd have sold merch. I'd have turned this into a show. But I didn't, because this isn't entertainment. It's accountability. The judge nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defense attorney stood and said, "Your Honor, based on the sealed document submitted yesterday, and with the court's permission, I'd like to ask Mr. Musk one direct question." The judge exhaled. "Go ahead." "Mr. Musk," the attorney said, voice steady, "based on your recollection and the records now in evidence, do you believe the person who contacted you was acting on behalf of Hillary Clinton?" The room froze. Musk didn't look shocked. He'd known this was coming. He took a breath, then said, "I don't know if she personally ordered it. I wasn't in the room. But the person who called me was her campaign's chief of staff at the time, and they made it very clear they were speaking for the campaign leadership." He paused. "So yes, I believe the message came from her operation. Whether she knew the exact words? I can't say. But in any organization that big, the boss sets the tone. And the tone was, stay quiet or else." He didn't shout, didn't smirk, just stated it like a fact he'd carried too long. Gasps, shouts. The judge banged her gavel. "Order! This is a courtroom, not a rally!" Outside, the news exploded. Within minutes, headlines blared, "Musk directly links Clinton campaign to pressure." But what got less attention, though it mattered more, was what he said next. "But here's what I keep thinking," he continued, voice softer now. "Even if she did it, is she the only one? Or is this just how the game's played by everyone who's been in power too long?" That question hung in the air like smoke. Later, during a break, a janitor mopping the hallway overheard two lawyers talking. "This changes everything," one said. "Or nothing," the other replied. "Because who's going to act on it now? It's old news dressed in new clothes." But the janitor kept mopping, thinking about his daughter, who worked for a small nonprofit. She'd once told him how a city grant disappeared after she wrote a letter about pollution in their neighborhood. "They didn't say why," she'd said. "But I knew." Now hearing Musk talk about permits and pressure, it felt familiar. Not because of politics, but because of power. Back in court, the plaintiff's team tried to regain control. They called their own witness, a former tech executive who claimed Musk's company had indeed copied code. But even as he spoke, people were distracted. Phones buzzed. Reporters typed furiously. The legal case was still there, but it felt like background noise now. What mattered was the unspoken question: what happens next? By afternoon, the judge announced a surprise. She'd reviewed the sealed document and ruled it admissible. It was an internal email chain from a mid-level regulator, dated 2016, referencing strategic delays for entities with high public commentary risk. It didn't name Musk directly, but the timing matched his testimony exactly. When the defense read a line from it aloud, "Let's let this one cool off until after the election," the room went dead silent. Not because it proved a crime, but because it proved a pattern. That evening, across the country, people gathered in unexpected places. In a diner in Iowa, two truck drivers debated whether this was just politics or something worse. In a library in Georgia, a group of college students stayed late, comparing the email language to other declassified documents. In a living room in California, an older couple watched the news replay and said nothing for a long time, until the woman finally whispered, "We used to think this only happened in other countries." The real impact wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet conversations happening in kitchens and cars and break rooms, places where people don't have cameras, but where trust is built. And then late that night, something unexpected happened. A statement was released, not by Musk, not by Clinton, but by a coalition of former government ethics officers, retired judges and transparency advocates. They didn't take sides. Instead, they called for a review of how informal pressure is applied in regulatory processes. Whether or not wrongdoing occurred in this specific case, they wrote, "The testimony has revealed a system where silence is rewarded and speech is penalized." That's a problem for all of us. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Back at the courthouse, as the lights went out for the night, a security guard locked the doors. He'd heard every word from the hallway. He didn't care about billionaires or politicians. But he remembered a time years ago when he'd reported a safety issue at a government building and got transferred to the night shift the next week. No explanation, just consequences. Now, hearing Musk describe something so similar, he felt a strange mix of anger and relief. Anger that it still happened. Relief that someone finally said it out loud, because that was the real story of day 4. Not the naming of a name, but the naming of a feeling. The quiet understanding that spreads when one person breaks the silence and 100 others realize they're not alone. And as the city slept, the question wasn't, who did what? It was, what do we do now? Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you know the cost of silence,
staying quiet feels like a choice, not a necessity. Part 4 ended not with a bang,
but with 1,000 small decisions being made in the dark, to speak up tomorrow, to ask harder questions, to believe that truth still matters, even when it's messy, even when it's inconvenient, even when it comes from someone you don't fully trust, because in the end, it's not about who's perfect, it's about who's willing to try. The 5th and final day didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the first real beginning. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was smaller than ever, just a handful of reporters, a few curious onlookers, and one woman holding a sign that simply read, "Thank you for speaking." No chants, no cameras shoved in faces, no shouting, just quiet attention. The rain from earlier in the week had washed the streets clean, and the morning sun hit the courthouse steps like it was trying to warm something that had been cold for too long. Inside, the air was calm. The legal case, the original reason for all this, was wrapping up. Lawyers gave short closing statements. The plaintiff's side stuck to the facts about software and contracts. The defense barely mentioned them. Instead, they focused on something else: context. This case, the attorney said, is not just about code. It's about what happens when truth becomes a liability, when speaking up carries a price, and when silence becomes the default, even for those who can afford to speak. The judge listened, then turned to Musk, who was still seated in the witness box, though his testimony was technically over. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice softer than usual, "is there anything else you'd like to add before we adjourn?" He looked surprised. He hadn't expected that. He glanced around, not at the cameras, not at the lawyers, but at the people in the back rows. The retired investigator, the former regulator, the students, the janitor who'd been listening from the hall. Then he nodded. "Just this," he said. "I didn't come here to take down anyone. I came because I got tired of pretending the system works the way we tell kids it does. We teach them in school that if you tell the truth, things will be fair. But then they grow up and learn that truth only matters if it's convenient." He paused, rubbing his temple like he was fighting a headache, or maybe just the weight of everything he'd carried. "I'm not a hero. I've made mistakes, big ones. But if there's one thing I hope comes from this, it's that people stop waiting for someone perfect to speak up. You don't need to be rich. You don't need to be famous. You just need to say, 'This doesn't feel right,' and mean it." He looked down at his hands. "And if enough people say it, maybe the system starts listening." The judge didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she simply said, "Court is adjourned," no gavel, no dramatic exit. Just the quiet scrape of chairs as people stood. But what happened next was what no one could have predicted. Over the following days, the story didn't fade. It deepened. News outlets stopped focusing only on the accusation and started looking at the pattern. Investigative teams dug into old permit logs, FOIA requests, internal memos from multiple agencies. Not just one administration, but several. What they found wasn't a smoking gun pointing to one person. It was something broader, a culture where informal pressure, quiet delays, and unspoken warnings had become routine tools of control, and the public response wasn't outrage. It was recognition. A school teacher in Michigan wrote a letter to her local paper about how her principal asked her to tone down her lessons on voting after she criticized a school board decision. A small farmer in Nebraska shared how his organic certification got extra scrutiny after he spoke at a town hall about water pollution. A nurse in Florida described being moved to a less desirable shift after questioning hospital billing practices. These stories weren't about politics. They were about power and how it's used in everyday places, far from Washington or Silicon Valley. Then quietly, change started. A state legislature introduced a bill requiring all regulatory delays over 30 days to include written justification. A federal watchdog group launched a hotline for public employees to report informal pressure without fear of retaliation. Even a few tech companies, rivals of Musk's, issued statements supporting the idea that public commentary should never affect business permits. None of it was huge. None of it made front-page headlines, but together it added up to something real. Back in the city where it all began, life returned to normal, but not the same normal. The courthouse steps were empty most days. The news vans were gone. But in coffee shops and community centers, people talked differently. They asked more questions. They listened more closely. They stopped assuming that silence meant agreement. One afternoon, the retired federal investigator who'd sat in the back row returned, not for a hearing, but just to walk past the building. He stopped for a moment, looked up at the windows, and smiled faintly. He didn't know if anything would truly change. But he knew this. Someone had broken the spell of that's just how it is. And once that spell is broken, it's hard to put it back together. Meanwhile, Musk disappeared from the spotlight. No interviews. No tweets about the case. He went back to building rockets, fixing cars, arguing about AI. Some people called him a hero. Others called him a manipulator. Most just went on with their lives. But something had shifted in the air. Months later, at a small town hall meeting in Ohio, a young woman stood up during public comment. She was nervous, her hands shook, her voice wavered, but she spoke clearly. She talked about how her neighborhood's request for safer crosswalks had been ignored for years, until she started posting about it online. Then suddenly the city found funding. She didn't mention Musk, didn't need to. But when someone in the audience whispered, "How'd you get them to listen?" she just said, "I stopped being afraid to sound inconvenient." That was the real legacy of those 5 days in court. Not the names, not the accusations, not even the legal outcome, which in the end ruled narrowly in favor of the plaintiff on the software issue, but noted disturbing patterns in regulatory behavior. The real legacy was permission. Permission to speak even when you're not sure you'll be heard. Permission to question even when you're told it's not your place. Permission to believe that your voice matters, not because you're special, but because silence helps no one. And in the quiet corners of the country, that permission was being used. A city councilman in Texas started publishing meeting notes in plain language so regular people could understand them. A group of factory workers in Pennsylvania formed a transparency committee to track safety complaints. A librarian in Oregon created a truth shelf with books on civic rights, media literacy, and how government really works. None of it was flashy. None of it went viral. But it was real. Because the truth is, systems don't change because one billionaire says something in court. They change because thousands of ordinary people decide on ordinary days that they're done pretending. And maybe that's what made those 5 days matter. Not because they exposed a secret, but because they reminded everyone that the most powerful thing any of us can do is simply say what we see. As the months passed, the story faded from the news. But it lived on in other ways. In classrooms where teachers used it as a case study in ethics. In podcasts where hosts debated the line between pressure and politics. In late-night conversations between friends who finally admitted, "Yeah, that's happened to me too." And in the end, that was enough. Because real change doesn't roar. It whispers. It starts with one person saying, "This isn't right," then another, and before you know it, the whole room is listening. The courtroom is empty now. The files are boxed away. The cameras are off. But somewhere right now, someone is choosing not to stay quiet, and that's how it begins again.